The Sumerian city of Ur of the Chaldees, some say Chaldees, was one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world. It was a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced culture which was no different to our modern-day digital world. But what made it so unique? This is part one of a two-part study. In part two, we'll be looking at prophecy, but in part one, we'll be looking at history and look at the way the past affects the present. And as I encourage you at all times, please research everything you see in this study.
The 19th century was a time of deep searching, scientific discoveries, exploration, and the development of new inventions and also reinventions of things that we still use today. Matches, elevators, aspirin, the sewing machine, chewing gum, the typewriter, the telephone, the X-ray, film to capture our most cherished moments, and the steam engine that developed into modern trains that totally changed the whole industry of transport and travel, making remote and exotic places more accessible. Men could now re-explore the most distant parts of the earth, log the data, and give us a much clearer understanding of this global terrain and how nature works in different parts of the world. Travel also helped to once again reconnect mankind, where a closer and deeper understanding of each other's ethnic groups and their distinct unique features could be now more closely studied and documented. But with a thirst for knowledge, different ideas were to also clash with each other over who has the right interpretation of how this world came into existence. The current dominant worldview that is rooted in Western thought has shaped almost every department of thinking. And with its rejection of God, man believes that he can now take God's place and experiment with the human genome, stepping outside of ethical boundaries and teaching children from very young that they are nothing more than brute beasts who are governed by animal instincts and not by a divine mandate, but live by the code of nature, the survival of the fittest, where different ethnic groups are compared to an animal in a zoo. And a man who compiled this idea cleverly racialized human history, putting one ethnic group at the very top of human intelligence. This idea has influenced English literature, and a generation is definitely being educated in this worldview of man's origins. The man who introduced this idea to the modern world is still revered, where many take selfies alongside his statue in the Natural History Museum in London, England. And this 19th century naturalist, Charles Darwin, still influences in the digital world of the 21st century how people view the past, how they look at the current and present world, how we view each other, how we approach sexuality and politics, and how businessmen and bankers approach economics. But at the same time, the 19th century also saw a deep search of the Bible. After so many wars and the abolition of slavery, people really searched the pages of the Holy Scriptures to see whether it still had any relevance to the modern world. Bible seekers not only wanted faith, but like Moses and Gideon, wanted to see something visible and tangible to strengthen their faith. The British Museum in the 19th century opened the doors to the distant past, and one of its most viewed exhibits is the history of the Orient, the Near East. The two men who reintroduced us to this culture were Sir Henry Kendrick Rawlinson on the left and Sir Austin Henry Layard on the right. With a skill-trained eye for detail, they were one of the very few extremely rare Western scholars that could intelligently assess human history without measuring the accomplishments of every ancient culture with the technological and scientific achievements of modern-day Europeans. That is a very rare gift and skill in academia. Very few can do that. But they laid a very solid foundation for the turbulent beginnings of the following century.
My mom didn't want me dying in some white man's war.
If you fail, it will be a massacre.
During World War I, when European nations whose monarchies were all related to each other by marriage were fighting over land expansion and the control over each other's vast colonial territories, that had more human casualties than the 901 major wars of the past 2,400 years combined, sending millions of highly educated, innocent young men to their deaths, as well as many very loyal men from their colonial territories that stretched across the globe. In the first year of that war in 1914, a young man, while excavating and surveying the Middle East, was interrupted by the war and had to temporarily give up his full-time archaeological work and enlisted into the army, where he served as a British intelligence officer in Egypt during World War I. He was in charge of the British Museum's excavations at Karşıymış in Turkey until 1914, where he stands in this photo on the right alongside a bas-relief of the ancient Hittite culture. But it was his excavations in Iraq that made him a hero in the West, but a criminal thief in the East, that he brought to light a long-lost culture. Just off Clapton Road in the east of London is a road called Southwall Road, and a 1-minute walk into that road there is a plaque dedicated to where he once lived, and Sir Charles Leonard Woolley is described as an archaeologist who excavated the Sumerian city of Ur of the Chaldees in modern-day southern Iraq. He logged his fieldwork and documented it in a number of autobiographical publications, and this is what he said. Ur lies halfway between Baghdad and the head of the Persian Gulf, a society in which the architecture was familiar with all the most basic principles of construction known to us today. The merchant carried on a far-flung trade and recorded his transactions in writing. The army was well organized and victorious, which carried the civilization of the Sumerians from the Persian Gulf in Western Asia to the mountains of Anatolia in Asia Minor, to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in southern Europe and North Africa. Agriculture prospered and great wealth gave scope to luxury. Masses of vessels in copper, silver, stone, including exquisite examples of volcanic glass, lapis lazuli, alabaster and marble and gold, carnelian, agate and chalcedony, quantities of fine painted pottery, bowls of greystone, and a large number of cockle shells. Since he penned those words in 1929, almost a century later, men are still intricately studying this ancient city, for it holds a lot of clues to the past. And as we carefully go through this study, we will observe that this city was no different to our modern-day built-up societies, and we will get an understanding of what the patriarch Abraham left behind. Because we are consciously and unconsciously influenced by Darwinian evolution on how we look at the past, we think that only in the modern times we have accomplished technological achievements that includes beautifully designed tree-lined avenues, highly sophisticated modern architecture, the global economic financial system of trade, and modern schools. And in these schools all over the world, children are taught that modern man has reached the apex of human brilliance. But that is a distorted view of history, for the modern English alphabet can be traced right back to Sumerian and its wedge-shaped alphabetic script called cuneiform. Ur of the Chaldees, as it is mentioned in the Bible, was one of the great urban centers of the Sumerian civilization of southern Iraq that boasted paved roads, tree-lined avenues, schools, poets, and stunning works of art and architecture. The kingdom was governed by a real administration and code of laws. Sumerian script called cuneiform is the earliest known writing system in the world, according to London's Telegraph newspaper. Our journey will now build and pick up in the Orient, the Middle East, a place that attracted men in the 19th century who wanted to earnestly understand the development of human culture. What did the men of Ur actually look like?
The Assyrian people are the indigenous oldest people in the Middle East. They belong to the ancient Assyria, Babylon, Nineveh, Ur, and they live in that area and establish, and given the humanity, the civilization.
That man was a descendant of the ancient Assyrians, who once ruled an empire that brutally dominated and terrorized the Middle East, which stretched into Europe, where they are usually depicted as very muscular, with long, flowing black hair. The different Arab tribes also looked very similar to their Assyrian neighbors in facial features. And as you carefully observe the men of this region, though they differ, they all have a similarity about them. Kings were usually bearded, and prime ministers, and especially the priests, were usually clean-shaven. The men of Syria also looked quite similar. Some of them looked like they have deep unresolved childhood issues. The next-door neighbors in Iran differed a little. Though they were light brown, some were of a very dark brown complexion. This was a common occurrence throughout the Middle East and Asia, as well as in other parts of the world. The Mediterranean people of ancient Crete in southern Europe had either very dark brown skin, and some had a very light brown skin. The black Nubians of the Sudan also had a mixture of some with very dark brown skin and others who had a lighter shade of brown. All ethnic groups varied in their melatonin skin pigment, but the people of the Middle East, though differing in their appearance, all had a distinct genetic phenotype, that very big nose, a distinct characteristic trait of the descendants of the biblical Shem. And this was what the men and women from Ur of the Chaldees looked like, as can be seen from these artifacts in the British Museum. And you can get a picture of what the patriarch Abraham must have looked like. This society was a very highly sophisticated, technologically advanced society that flourished and prospered for many years. The people of Ur worked with every material that they could find. They made beautifully designed cups from ostrich eggs, a method that was also used in the Sudan and later on in Greece. The royal staffs were made from wood, and one of the most dominant materials they used was clay, where it was sculpted into everything from bowls and vases, and the preserving of their history on clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform inscriptions. They could carve into stone using a very early pressure flaking technique called lithith reduction, a process of shaping a hard material from its early natural state into either an ornament, tool, or weapon. This takes a skillful technique that reflected creativity and advanced technology. These sculptures from the Sumerian city of Ur could carve an image of either a human or an animal from different materials that showed they had a knowledge of mathematics, a sense of perspective and anatomical detail, and the creativity of the self-aware. But how similar were they to our modern society? You'll see that they were no different to us. The 21st century's boom of tech companies has led to a recent dramatic demand and supply in minerals to boost the production of electronic devices that drives the modern tech industry as well as the automobile and aviation industry. The mining industry has drastically increased in sales that is pivotal to the world's economy, making a total revenue of $683 billion in 2018, up from $93 billion in 2002. China is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of rare earths that supplies the different minerals that makes up the parts of our modern tech gadgets to safely function. People think that mining and the science of geology, the study of rocks and minerals, has only come about in the modern world, but it has been a consistent custom from antiquity. Men have always been mining the earth and studying the different materials in the earth and their different value, and have sculpted and shaped these rocks into absolutely beautiful design pieces of artwork. These skilled stonecutters of Ur were able to cut through such hard material with technological precision at such an early time period and neatly engrave pictographs, phonograms, and a logophonetic writing system today we call cuneiform into hard rock, so that generations of people, thousands of years later, could see the genius of these men, where every rock that was mined, quarried and imported was worked upon and delicately sculpted with their creative mind. While cutting into stone, the earliest men of Iraq used an igneous rock, one of the first materials alongside clay. And living in this modern high-tech world, you may wonder what is the sharpest cutting instrument on earth. It is not Damascus steel from Syria in the Levant on display in London Science Museum, neither the samurai sword from feudal Japan in London's Victorian Albert Museum, neither the sharpness of a single crystal diamond cutting tool that many people think is the sharpest cutting instrument on earth. But from around the 50th century BC, these blades made from the volcanic glass obsidian are still the sharpest cutting instrument on the earth, whose cutting precision is far superior to that of a modern surgeon's steel scalpel. Also from that same material in Iraq, the stonemasons of Ur sculpted a beautiful shaped carved bowl from obsidian. The men of Ur were to also use different mined minerals to create their different wares. In Sir Austin Henry Layard's excavated work that he documented in his discoveries in the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, he wrote in 1853 that the engraved gems and cylinders discovered in the ruins bear ample witness to the skill of the Babylonian lapidaries. The figures are cut with delicacy and spirit. 76 years later, in 1929, Sir Charles Leonard Woolley confirmed what Layard saw in his own observations, and he wrote that the carvings of these seals with the combination of naturalism with form style bespeaks a state of society, and highlighted in red, well advanced on the road to civilization properly so called. Most of the cylinder seals are roughly about the size of an AA battery, and the early sculptors of Sumeria intricately designed their art into different minerals. This cylinder seal is made from aragonite, a whitish, yellowish calcium carbonate mineral, and this one was made from calcite that has the greatest variety of crystals than any other mineral, where they also made different shaped pottery and vases from this mineral. This bowl was made from gypsum, a colorless to white calcium sulfate dehydrate mineral that the Assyrians were to later use in the 9th to 8th century BC, whose engineers were to intricately carve the Sumerian, human-headed, five-legged eagle-wing protection deity called Lamassu that was usually in pairs at the entrances of the ancient Assyrian palaces in Iraq. The vase on the left from Ur was made from the metamorphic rock marble, and the jar on the right with the lid on the top was made from the greenish-looking mineral called chlorite. So the Sumerian sculptors of Ur could carve and sculpt from clay, rock, and minerals, but they also perfected sculpting from another material with a skill that also existed in the surrounding nations of Afro-Eurasia. Sir John Gardner Wilkinson is one of the credited founders of modern Egyptian studies in the English-speaking world, whose papers are in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England. In his 19th century 2-volume work, The Ancient Egyptians, he documented an ancient craft that existed from antiquity. From the mention in Genesis chapter 24 verses 47 and 53 of the earrings and bracelets and jewels of silver and gold in the days of Abraham, Wilkinson said, "It is evident that in Asia as well as in Egypt, the art of metallurgy was known at a very remote period." The metal techniques that are in use today to bend, mold, and shape different metals were already known by the metalsmiths of Ur. They could remove traces of metals from rocks in a process called smelting. They could combine two or more metals and minerals, producing metals of different colors and strengths, which is called alloying and soldering. And they also use the metal technique called chasing, where a single piece of metal is hammered on the front side, sinking the metal. This bowl from Ur is dated to around 3000 BC and was made from the metal tin. They were also able to take silver, a soft greyish-white metallic chemical element, compound it and carve it into some of the most beautiful works of art that includes cups, vases, and bowls. They also made use of the metal copper and sculpted different things from it, also for their society. That includes this copper alloy vessel that is bound with a silver wire, working with different metals to create one object. But there is one metal that is probably the most used throughout recorded history, starting from antiquity and still in use to this very day, that can be found in religious temples, jewelry, and coinage, just to name a few. Gold is a dense, bright yellow, rare earth metallic chemical that is widely dispersed throughout the Earth's crust. It was the first metal that caught man's attention, and in the early days, says J.A. Wiley, gold was the most plentiful metal, for it was the first metal to be mentioned in the Bible, where it was abundant in what was once the world's largest and purest uncontaminated natural botanical garden, and it is one of the most stable commodities in the global stock market, where the gold bullion standard, those solid fine gold bars that are in the vaults of central banks around the world. In 2019, these banks made a record of $15.7 billion in gold purchases, but the desire for gold has also caused problems. In the 19th century, between 1846 and 1870, California's indigenous Indian population plunged from around 310,000 to 30,000, with an ethnic cleansing program endorsed by the Catholic missions and sanctioned by the state and federal government, where many of the murders were committed by the United States Army. A rough estimate of 100,000 men from Europe, Australia, China, Latin America, and 3/4 of them from North America flooded to that west coast state during the famous 1849 California gold rush that made many people rich and many communities extinct. The cryptocurrency Bitcoin Gold is a relatively new currency to the financial market, but how long has gold money been in existence? The oldest coined money in the world is from the Lydian state in Asia Minor, and it was minted from gold and silver from around the 7th century BC. In Egypt and North Africa, the Turin papyri of Egypt that was rediscovered in the early 19th century, that has been dated to around 1150 BC, is the oldest known surviving topographical, geographical, and geological map of the ancient world thus far, that has the oldest detailed description of a gold mine where they would mine for gold near the Nile River. And a recent document has shown that Egypt's neighbor, the Sudan, was also mining for gold in the earth from its embryonic beginnings. And these discoveries shows us that extracting minerals from the earth is an extremely old profession. Gold was the leading commodity that the black Nubians exported and traded with their next door neighbor Egypt, and this Nubian gold was then shaped and adorned for the lids of some of the earliest stone jars, and some of the wealthy in Egypt had their mummified bodies encased within a gold coffin. In Europe, the Varna necropolis gold treasure collection was rediscovered in 1972 in Bulgaria in Southeast Europe, and it is dated to the 5th millennium BC, and it is considered as the oldest human processed gold collection in the world on record thus far. And what it shows is that the earliest of men were not primeval savages at all, when they newly settled into their own territories. Further up into Northern Europe, there are also beautifully designed gold sculpted work from both England and Ireland in the ancient English section of the British Museum that is dated to around 2100 BC to 1100 BC. Some of these items include bracelets and cups, which shows that the metallurgists in the Northern Hemisphere thousands of years ago were technologically skilled, and that metallurgy existed in all continents at roughly around the same time. But the metalsmiths of Ur were excellent at their craft, intricately designing a golden sword with its detailed designed sheath. There is nothing new. They sculpted a beautifully designed golden helmet dated to the 26th century BC, where even the hair in a bun is neatly designed into the back of the helmet. When we look at modern day gold rings and know that a whole film series plot is made about them, the intricate design is amazing, especially when you see the process it went through to make it by these modern day goldsmiths. But it is not new. Gold rings were already being made thousands of years ago in Ur of the Chaldees by their metalsmiths. We are only reviving a lost art. Those men of the Sumerian plains in southern Iraq truly put the ing into bling. They probably made more objects out of solid gold than any other community around the world. The metalsmiths of Ur could sculpt gold into anything they wanted to, that included different thin sheets into a gold leaf, as well as sculpted bowls, earrings, cups, vases, vessels, jewelry, and cosmetic dishes. And the cups and vases were made by using the special technique of chasing. But how did the structure of that ancient Sumerian city work? How were they able to keep themselves financially stable? It functioned exactly the same way as our modern day society does, by using both a micro and a macroeconomic system to govern its society and to keep itself financially afloat.
So as we have clearly seen, Ur of the Chaldees and the surrounding nations in Afro-Eurasia operated no differently to our modern world. And when men are mining for the different minerals that make up our modern-day digital technological devices, it is the same mining that existed thousands of years ago. Nothing has changed. There is no new thing under the sun. But guess what? Even their economy functioned the same way, where they also had a global trade.
Today, sincere men and women are carefully combing through the materials that has been handed down to us from the archives of the oldest cultures in the ancient world, whether they be an accredited academic or a normal civilian, to piece together the different clues of man's early origins, and it is amazing what he is finding all over the world. In Afro-Eurasia, scientists are looking at a DNA that is showing what the earliest of men were like. But though we all have the same evidence in front of our face, man has to wrestle with an established modern Darwinian worldview versus a biblical worldview. But the evidence is showing that the earliest of men were brilliant-minded and creative. The world's oldest footwear are woven sandals that were discovered in 1938 in Fort Rock Cave in Central Oregon in the United States. They were made from the aromatic shrub sagebrush that is found in North America. The world's oldest known crown on record was discovered in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea in 1961. It is dated to around 4000 BC and it was carved from the metal copper. The world's oldest axe was made from the igneous rock basalt by the forefathers of the Australian Aborigines. Fishing has been around from the beginning, and the oldest fish hooks were discovered on the Japanese island of Okinawa in East Asia and were made from snail shells. The oldest known musical instruments thus far on record are a number of flutes that were discovered in a cave in southern Germany in Western Europe that were made from bird bone and mammoth ivory. And what about painting? The oldest known painting kit is the first known instance for deliberate planning, production, and creation of a compound, and it was made by the earliest of men of South Africa, who have the oldest art studio in the world, as well as the world's oldest evidence of chemistry. These discoveries from cultures all over the habitable globe once again shows that the earliest of men were not primeval savages at all, but were creative, innovative, highly sophisticated, and technologically advanced from the very beginning, and men who had a biblical worldview were fully aware of this. The museums of Egypt, Dr. Wiley said, in the lands of Italy, of Greece, of Assyria, and of India, the Great Valley of Mississippi, as well as in the regions of Mexico and Yucatan, display numerous indications of imitative skill. The same is observable in the arts of various tribes of Africa, Polynesia, and of other modern races in an equally primitive state. The Bible teaches in Genesis chapter 4 that not only were the earliest of men technologically brilliant, but it must have been passed on to the small number of men and women in a post-flood world who migrated from Anatolia or Asia Minor, that today is better known as Turkey and Armenia, and down the Euphrates and Tigris River in Sumer, in today what we call Iraq, is where men built the first number of city-states. Archaeology is now confirming that places like Göbekli Tepe in the southeastern Anatolian region of Turkey is the site for the oldest known monumental architecture, the world's oldest known temple on the earth, where men cut into limestone and shaped them into large T-shaped pillars. Also in that region known as the Fertile Crescent was the city of Babylon that has handed down to us many of the things we use today. Göbekli Tepe has been labeled as the origin of civilization, and Iraq has been titled as the cradle of civilization. But what exactly is civilization? The word civilization comes from the Latin root civic, which means citizen or city. It is when a community of people using the different materials available to them develop roads, architecture, and clothing from textiles, metals, plastics, clay, rocks, wood, and they also experiment with science, maths, astronomy, and agriculture, and create a government with sometimes a huge metropolitan city complex. And men are confirming that civilizations are no older than 7,000 to 8,000 years old. But archaeologists are enraged at the cold-hearted warhawks of the United States government, whose military have not only put graffiti on priceless architecture in Iraq, but whose fighter jets have dropped bombs on sacred sites that have stood the stress of time for thousands of years, greatly damaging the home of Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees, that has helped us to piece together some of the vital missing pieces of the past. It was the early culture of Ur and its horned deity that was passed down to the Assyrians, who inherited their culture. But what have the Assyrians passed on down to us today? What did we inherit from them? In 2007, it was noted that the Assyrians invented timekeeping, paved roads, door keys, libraries, magnifying glasses, aqueducts, flushing toilets, and even guitars. They also pioneered the calendar. The Romans are usually credited for the invention of roads that stretched throughout their vast empire. But what we see today that came down from the Assyrians was originally from the Sumerian city of Ur. We inherited things like the calendar, the stringed instrument the guitar, the famous Roman aqueducts, the flushing toilet, and door keys have only been reintroduced into our modern world, and the US Library of Congress, that has the largest collection of books on Earth, was preceded by an even older one, and an evolutionist and eugenicist had to put the facts before his beliefs. And H.G. Wells said that the most remarkable collection of ancient documents in the world is the Old Testament. Ashurbanipal, Greek Sardanapalus, the son of Esarhaddon, became a great collector of the clay tablets of the past, and his library, which has been unearthed, is now the most precious source of historical material in the world. The 7th century BC lion-hunting Neo-Assyrian monarch Ashurbanipal was the son of Esarhaddon, an Assyrian king and military strategist who is mentioned twice in the Bible and whose busts are in the Pergamon Museum in Germany and also in the British Museum. Ashurbanipal built an extensive royal library consisting of over 30,000 tablets that incorporated Assyrian and Babylonian texts that included hymns, diplomacy, letters, medicine, tablets of synonyms, different alphabetic scripts, literature, poetry, lists of kings, omens, divination, legislations, financial matters, history, law, and geography. It also has some of the most important tablets that were records of astronomy that documented the movements in the heavens. Auroras, better known as the Northern Lights, are dazzling light shows that take place when waves or change particles from the sun collide with Earth's magnetic field. And there are 3 Assyrian and Babylonian cuneiform tablets dated from the 7th century BC that describes red clouds or red glow in the night sky. They are the oldest documented record of the Northern Lights, preserved in clay on cuneiform tablets, and the people who inhabited the ancient plains of Iraq had a brilliant understanding of astronomy and mathematics. But how did they acquire that knowledge? Today, when we look at the different crystal instruments that help us to enlarge an object, from a small magnifying glass that we can hold in our hand to a telescopic lens in an observatory, it is generally believed that the creation of the lens is a modern phenomenon with its development by scientist and mathematician Sir Isaac Newton. But a 19th century Scottish scientist, inventor, writer, mathematician and astronomer was to build upon Newton's foundation. Sir David Brewster was the principal of the Edinburgh University, and it was his speciality in the field of optics that was to enhance the 19th century study of Assyriology. Sir Austin Henry Layard said, "With the glass bowls was discovered a rock crystal lens with opposite convex and plane faces. Its properties could scarcely have been unknown to the Assyrians, and we have consequently the earliest specimen of a magnifying and burning glass from ancient Assyria. I am indebted, he said, to Sir David Brewster, who examined the lens. It gives a tolerably distinct focus. Its plane surface must be greatly inclined to the axis of the hexagonal prism of quartz from which it must have been taken, intended to be used as a lens either for magnifying or for concentrating the rays of the sun. The famous Assyrian Nimrod lens is dated to around the 8th or 7th century BC. It is not currently on display for public viewing, but the narrator had an opportunity to film it while it was. It was made according to Layard from rock crystal quartz, a material that people still use for a face massage. This quartz was mined and quarried and then eventually shaped into a lens. And what is interesting is that men were shaping rock crystal quartz from early Ur, as can be seen from this artifact in the British Museum. So what other influences has Ur of the Chaldees had on our modern culture?
GDP is an important gauge of the overall health of an economy. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. Simply put, GDP measures the total value of all goods and services in a country. That means it measures a lot of stuff worth a lot of money. Here in the UK, GDP is around $2.5 trillion per year. In the United States, the world's biggest economy, it's around $19 trillion every year.
Thousands of years ago, successful farming was the bedrock of sophisticated city-states such as Ur and the powerful kingdoms in which they were sometimes welded together. The key to a lot of the function of society was the very rich agriculture and the concentration and control of the surplus to support priests, temple personnel, the hierarchy in general, and specialist producers in metalwork, pottery, and everything else that made up the complete economy. In its heyday, Ur was a hub of trade ranging as far as Afghanistan, India, Turkey, Oman, and Egypt. Great Britain is known to have one of the oldest modern styles of democracy, and its current head of state, Queen Elizabeth II, is the longest lived and longest reigning British monarch. She has seen successive governments and prime ministers come and go, but this structure of government is far from new. On a green cylinder seal from Ur in the British Museum is seated on the right under the moon god King Ur-Nammu, and in the center between two female deities on the left is his prime minister. As you can see, this structure of government goes right back to antiquity. All countries have laws. If not, there would be total chaos. And the law code of that same king, Ur-Nammu, that is dated to around 2100 BC, is the oldest known surviving legal text or law code in the world that was compiled during the Sumerian Renaissance in the city of Ur of the Chaldees. All governments need a well-trained and loyal military to protect its borders, its interests, and its civilian population from an outside invasion so that a nation can last and keep its stability. And when men are in the midst of battle, they need the most up-to-date equipment that includes body armor to shield their bodies from being riddled with bullets, especially a strong helmet that will protect their cranium from being targeted in warfare. But this is not a new thing. In the British Museum, there is a skull of a military officer from Ur with a copper helmet to protect his cranium, and the famous Standard of Ur, as Sir Leonard Willey said, is adorned with the well-trained military of Ur of the Chaldees, with one of the oldest depiction of the wheel. Music is without question one of the most powerful mediums in the world. Even if you're not a trained musician, you can easily create your own beats in your head or just simply tap them onto a hard surface that can vibrate. And no matter where you go in the world, it seems to be one of the main driving forces of that unique individual culture. It can be used for positive motives that can create a calming environment or a pregnant mother for her newborn baby while it is still growing in the womb. And scientific studies have shown the psychological effects positive music can have on our mental state. But it can also be used negatively to manipulate individuals or communities, and governments have used it as a form of torture either in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba in the Caribbean and in Panama in South America, to name a few. The first recorded musician in the Bible, Jubal, where we get the word jubilee from, also used music negatively. The English word handle is a translation of the Hebrew word tafas, which means to manipulate. The harp is a stringed instrument whose calming melody is usually played at an orchestral performance. But the oldest known surviving harp and stringed instrument ever discovered that is made up of silver and dates around 2500 BC is from Ur of the Chaldees in the British Museum. The narrator has no idea if people still partake in board games where family and friends used to come together and socialize, and the mobile cell phone was not an everyday distraction. But if anyone has those memories, they were the good old days. But it does not seem to be a new thing. The raw game of Ur was a board game of 20 squares dated to around 3000 BC, and it is in the British Museum, and is one of the oldest board games ever discovered in the world. In art school, men and women are trained in either sculpting a real-life body or face, or in the skill of ceramics, and make beautifully designed bowls or vases, usually from clay. And these different bowls in the British Museum are dated to around 3000 BC. That also gives us an insight into the ancient city of Ur and confirms that we, in the modern world, are only continuing an ancient art that existed from antiquity. What about farming? Farming has been classified as the oldest profession on earth, and when we go into the supermarket to shop for our different foods, most, if not all, of what we put into our mouths has either been picked from a tree or vineyard or ploughed from the ground by the farmer. When we wake up in the morning, we should always have the most important meal of the day, our breakfast, to sustain us, which usually consists of our cereal that should fill us up. But how long has cereal been around for? As scientists do archaeological and forensic studies on the earliest cultures, they have discovered that early cereals were discovered in Göbekli Tepe in Asia Minor, in North and Central Sudan in Northeast Africa, in southern Italy in South Central Europe, and in ancient Iran in Western Asia. But the oldest profession in the world is now under major threat from many different sources.
Locusts are considered a major threat to crops in many countries.
The first swarms traveled to eastern Africa over the Red Sea from Yemen.
It's the worst locust invasion in 70 years.
Just to give you a sense of how big these swarms are, one was spotted in a part of Kenya that contained about 200 billion of these creatures, and in the sky it occupied a space 3 times the size of New York City. And as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has warned, they could increase 500-fold by June if not contained and checked immediately, and spread elsewhere.
We had extremely wet conditions and then a number of typhoons that came in December and then created extremely favorable conditions for desert locusts to come towards Ethiopia, Somalia, and then Kenya now.
Environmental and political changes can affect the whole climate of a business, and the oldest industry on earth is under major threat. As a result of the highly contagious coronavirus, Chinese farmers are struggling to get customers, especially from the US. Britain's 2020 January the 31st Brexit exodus from the European community has put many farmers in the UK under intense pressure to conform to new legislations and apply to policies that is affecting their livelihoods. But there are a number of monopolies that, if you carefully watch their growth and meteoric rise, they are slowly taking over the entire world, destroying any competition that stands in their way. Companies like Monsanto that wants to have total control over the global seed market was brought by a German company, Bayer, in 2018, where Big Pharma now owns Big Agribusiness. This conglomerate and its desire for dominance has weakened the farming industry in the United States and elsewhere, threatening the oldest occupation on Earth that keeps supermarkets' shelves packed and squeezing out the competition of small farmers. But she is not alone. The modern digital world has given us e-commerce that is likened to the new industrial revolution, but like an uncontrollable plague, it is absolutely destroying whole industries. Famous stores in the UK are now closing down, threatening high street businesses, and the once famous shopping malls in the USA are also closing down rapidly like a pack of dominoes, and those old brick and mortar retailers, Radio Shack, Toys R Us and Sears, are now bankrupt. One of the companies that is key to this decline is Amazon.com, that have made shopping malls crumbling monuments of the past. Its founder and current CEO, billionaire Jeff Bezos, has also invested into another industry, as well as billionaire Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google and Alphabet, and billionaire Masayoshi Son and his $100 billion hedge fund. These three billionaires are financing a business called Plenty, an agricultural company that specializes in indoor agricultural vertical farming, who want to build a giant indoor farm next to every major city in the entire world. It has also spread into Asia from the Middle East to the Far East, and it also poses a major threat to the traditional farming industry, according to the Financial Times. With high uncontrollable debts and swarms of locusts invading Bolivia in South America, Australia in Oceania, Sardinia in the Mediterranean, and in Pakistan in South Asia that is threatening its cotton industry, and in Yemen and parts of the continent of Africa. All of these factors have led to something that your average person is totally unaware of. Farming, the oldest profession on earth, has the highest suicide rate than any other occupation on the face of the whole planet. In the UK, one farmer commits one suicide a week. Hundreds die every year in France. In America, there is also a huge increase in suicides among farmers, but it is in India where they have the highest casualties for this old profession. But where did farming actually originate from? The very first thing God instructed man to do at the beginning of time was to become a biologist in the field of botany, mineralogy, and zoology, which is the study of different plants and animals, so that he was never idle and that he was always learning and aware of the laws of nature and how the environment worked. It was meant to be a lifetime study. He would intricately study the different colors and shapes of every living creature, and he would name each one of them according to the distinct characteristics of that species, and he would see how God's detailed and intricate design and blueprint was upon every single living creature that flew in the air, made a nest, burrowed in the ground, swam in the sea, or walked on the land. After man took his eyes off God and looked inwards, he still studied the different materials that was available to him and learned to make tents to protect him from the elements, and looked after the cattle for his household. And man passed down this trade and technology and his knowledge of nature to succeeding generations that still exist with us to this very day. Not a primeval savage at all. This is documented in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15, where man was instructed to care for the environment. In Genesis chapter 2:19, he was also instructed to name every single species. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 20, the earliest of men made tents to protect him against the elements, and he raised different cattle, and the profession of farming was to continue with Noah, who was an husbandman, another name for a farmer, and the raising of cattle was to also continue with Abraham, where he most probably learned this trade while in Ur, and his nephew also had the exact same profession. While men are continuously debating in academic circles of where agriculture and farming originated from, Christopher Ehret, the distinguished research professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, is clear that no region on Earth can claim its actual origin. In his book, An African Classical Age, he showed that farming emerged in different places independently all over the world. He documented and said that it was merely one of as many as 8 or 9 distinct, far-separated regions of the globe in which agriculture independently emerged from the 10th to the 6th millennium BC. Southeast Asia, Mexico, Highland South America, at least 3 and possibly 4 regions in Africa, and possibly North China and lowland South America were equally seminal centers in the creation of agriculture as we know it today. As archaeologists unearth the past, it has been discovered that the oldest image of farming is a petroglyph discovered in Armenia in Asia Minor. The oldest plough was discovered in southern Italy in South Europe. The oldest known sickle was discovered in Israel in Western Asia. And farming also developed independently in Egypt in North Africa and in the Indus Valley Civilization in Pakistan, India in South Asia. And all these farming tools that are in use today, such as the sickle, was also in use way back in Ur of the Chaldees, as can be seen in this clay sickle on display in the British Museum dated to around 3000 BC. And even when old school modern day farmers who still use the method of pulling the plough with the cattle, it is only a continuation of an ancient custom in Mesopotamia in Iraq, as can be seen on the cylinder seal in the British Museum, with the third horn deity with a plough in its hand offering it to another seated deity. Despite agriculture, how else did Ur financially sustain itself? In the final part of this study, we will see that it functioned exactly the same way as our economy. One of the main industries that kept Ur financially stable, besides agriculture, was trade. The growth of every nation's economy depends upon a number of key factors. One of them is the spending power of each citizen. What we spend each day is essential to the growth of that nation's economy. The more we spend, the more stable the economy. That is why we are constantly being bombarded with advertisements by companies depending on where you live in the world, so that their businesses can stay afloat and not go bankrupt. If individual citizens were to stop spending on the different items that we use each day, such as food, clothing, cars, and houses to protect us from the elements or an intruder, or when we are stressed and want to go abroad and just unwind on a quiet flight to escape from the stress of work. If we were to also stop spending money on traveling, that nation's economy would instantly crumble, go into bankruptcy, and there would be riots and instant civil war. The other thing that is central to a nation's economy is trade. Every single economy in the world depends upon it to keep it afloat, and this was also what kept the economy of Ur of the Chaldees financially stable, and we are only continuing an ancient financial system. There is absolutely nothing new.
China is going to be purchasing more than $250 billion worth of goods from our country. That's massive. Those are numbers that nobody's ever heard of before. And that number can grow. It can grow. With time, it's going to grow substantially, I predict.
The World Trade Organization, that deals with the global rules of international trade between nations, published a commercial in 2014 that goes into details of the individual countries that supplies and ships the different materials to the many countries and corporations around the world in things that we use every day. Your average person is probably not interested in where their pen was made or what materials made up the construction of their bicycle, and why should they? That takes up too much of your time of your daily discourse. But when did international trade actually begin? Many are led to believe that it is a very recent phenomenon in human history, that started with the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus that has recently been called the Columbian Exchange. But there was one well-travelled intellectual who knew that it preceded Columbus by thousands of years, and he knew that to understand how everything works today, you have to travel right back in time for the answers. The Right Honourable Sir Austin Henry Layard was one of those very few rare people that could balance his knowledge and experience of politics with archaeology and history with a biblical worldview. At a time when many famous Western photographers, zoo owners, showmen, writers, philosophers, businessmen, historians, politicians, missionaries, explorers, geographers, scientists, eugenicists, biologists, professors, and colonialists in the 19th century were dehumanizing non-European nations through the teaching of polygenesis and calling them uncivilized, semi-literate barbarous savages. Layard had a completely different approach, and he earnestly wanted to learn from the descendants of Ur through their manuscripts and from oral tradition. He worked for the British government as the Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, was the first Commissioner of Works, and he was also the British Ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, and he knew that succeeding cultures and nations learn from their predecessors, and that it was passed on down to their successors that we have also inherited today. Let us give a few examples. This human-headed four-legged winged deity from modern India was also found in the artwork in ancient Greece, the artwork from the Etruscans of ancient Italy, in the artwork of the 6th to 4th century BC Medo-Persian Empire in Western Asia, among the Anatolian culture in Asia Minor in modern Turkey, and as already shown among the artwork of the 8th to 7th century BC Assyrian Empire in northern Iraq and their next door neighbours in Mari, Syria, whose very detailed artwork that is dated to the 19th century BC also has the same winged 4 to 5-legged human-headed winged deity that is on display in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. And going back even further, there is an early Babylonian cylinder seal in that same museum, no evolving from the different cultures involved. And as shown in a previous study from EvenAtThe Doors, the trade of construction and the labouring of brickwork that keeps a building to be strong against the elements may seem like a new trade that has developed in the modern world. But as you dig a little deeper, the 7th century BC Neo-Babylonian Chaldean monarch, King Nebuchadnezzar II, was absolutely brilliant at construction, with his famous multicolored brickwork, the Ishtar Gate, on display in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, Germany, is a testimony to his architectural genius. But he inherited this from the older generation of Chaldeans at Ur, who preceded him by many centuries, and Layard knew that this technology, along with trade that developed the economy of the cities, could be traced right back to the days of Abraham. Layard said that it was through Babylon that the arts appear to have penetrated partly, if not entirely, into Persia, and the origin of Assyrian architecture, which I have elsewhere described, was especially that of Babylon. The language spoken by Abraham when he left Mesopotamia closely resembled Hebrew. The use of the term Chaldean is vague. That the Chaldees were at a very early period settled in cities, we learn from Genesis chapter 11 and verse 31. For Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. I confess that after carefully examining the arguments in favour of their Scythic and Indo-European descent, I see no reason to doubt the old opinion that they were a Semitic or Syro-Arabian people, as the Bible clearly said. The Babylonians and Assyrians carried on a considerable commerce with India. These manufacturers probably formed one of the principal branches of trade of this land of traffic and city of merchants. The round-built vessels that archaeologists saw the Arabs in Iraq use were the same ones that the ancient Assyrians navigated through the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, as can be seen in the British Museum. The Assyrians were very skilled at navigation. Their detailed artwork is a display of their navigational prowess and their conquering into new terrains, but they also inherited the trading tradition from Ur of the Chaldees, as recent evidence has shown. In Kultepe Kanesh, an ancient city in central Anatolia, an Assyrian settlement and the administrative capital of an Assyrian colonial network, were discovered 23,000 cuneiform documents dated from the 20th century to the 19th century BC of loans, business transactions, shipment documents, contracts, business letters, private letters, and official letters that describe the political, economic, social, personal, and political problems in business matters of a large scale and an extensive and very sophisticated overland trade between Ashur in modern-day northern Iraq and Kanesh in modern-day central Turkey, carried out by perhaps around 60 trading families who exported tin and textiles and brought back gold and silver. The tablets show that they had to pay different taxes when importing and exporting their goods, and like the toll charges in 19th century Britain that must be paid to cross the bridge that connects Battersea to Chelsea in the south of London, they also had to pay different toll charges when travelling from Assyria to Armenia. In the 21st century, there are a number of very reliable and credible published journals for public viewing in both academic and mainstream circles that are confirming what Layard recorded 2 centuries ago about trade in ancient Assyria, Babylonia in Iraq, and you realize that nothing has changed over the years at all. The Washington Post documented that more than 23,000 cuneiform texts inscribed in clay by ancient Assyrians are mostly business records, seals, and contracts, and the center of the largest trade colonies established by the Assyrians was Karum in Kultepe, and highlighted in red, it was the first organized trade center in the world, according to the Turkish newspaper Hurriyet Daily News. The British Museum has a number of these Assyrian trade tablets. Some are on display and others are out of view from the public, but they give us a picture of the ancient world and trading, and if you really want to know how the modern world works, you need to know how the ancient world once worked. Very few in today's world are willing to admit this, because it will clash with an established and fixed worldview. But one man knew otherwise. Layard continues and says that a system of navigable canal that may excite the admiration of even the modern engineer connected together the Euphrates and Tigris, those great arteries of her commerce. Modern skill and enterprise could scarcely make Babylon not only the emporium of the Eastern world, but the main link of commercial intercourse between the East and the West. It is difficult to determine how far the Babylonians may have navigated in vessels the Indian Ocean. Of the various articles of merchandise stored in Babylon, the produce of the islands and shores of the Persian Gulf, and even of India, formed an inconsiderable part. Pearls from the fisheries of Bahrain, which still supply Arabia, Persia, and Turkey, and perhaps from Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka. Cotton spices, frankincense, precious stones, ivory, ebony, silks, and dyes were amongst the objects of trade brought to her markets. They could only have been obtained from the southern coast of Arabia and directly or indirectly from the Indian peninsula. The prophet Isaiah also alludes to the ships of the Chaldeans. Timber for shipbuilding could have been floated with ease from the mountains of Armenia to the very quays of Babylon, or to her part at the head of the Persian Gulf. While we may think that these artificial man-made waterways called canals are the skill of modern-day engineering construction, the Netherlands being the most famous for them, they can be traced right back to Babylon in modern-day Iraq. This Babylonian tablet, dated to the 17th century BC, is the only known Babylonian working map of a canal irrigation system, with 22 lines and captions written in cuneiform that mentions about 5 different canals and irrigation systems to the west of the Euphrates. These engineers were definitely highly skilled, and what is even more intriguing is that the early men of Iraq also had a shipping industry where ships would stop and dock at the ports, and they have recently found a 4,000-year-old port near the homeland of Abraham. And what Layard said with the information he had in his day is now getting even clearer light. Some of the early model boats from Ur are on display in the British Museum, and these boats would have imported the timber from Armenia, as well as silk, cotton, different colored dyes, different smelling spices, precious gems that are still being traded today, and pearls. And from the days of Abraham to this very day, men from all over the world swim in the ocean of Bahrain for those precious pearls. Once again, nothing has changed. But it was in Oman, in the Persian Gulf, that the city of Ur depended upon most for its material that it acquired through trade, that included the aroma from its sweet smelling like incense. And they also swam in the depth of the ocean, where they exported the cockle shells that are on display in the British Museum from Ur, that they probably use for cosmetics. They also mined in the mountains of Oman to extract the mineral rock, diorite, that the men of Ur used to carve the faces of their rulers, as can be seen in these diorite artifacts in the British Museum. The men of Ur also imported bronze and copper that they used to make a foundation peg and their axes and many other things for daily use. When sailing through the Indian Ocean, they also imported that huge dog from India, Nepal, China, and Tibet called the Tibetan Mastiff. It was probably used as a huge guard dog, and Layard is clear that these dogs were imported from the East. And to solidify this ancient system of trade, archaeologists found seals from the Indus Valley civilization in Pakistan, India, in Iraq, that confirms that trade existed between these two ancient nations. And in both the Indian section of the British Museum and the Mesopotamian section of Ur is carnelian, a brownish reddish semi-precious gemstone mineral that was traded from India to Iraq. But there was one last precious mineral that made up most of the artwork from Ur of the Chaldees. They probably use it more than any other nation in human history. The 21st century's drive for mining for the $1 trillion worth of rare earth minerals in Afghanistan is only a revival of a custom that has been ongoing, not a new mining trend from the War on Terror. Men have been mining in the Afghan mountains for thousands of years for a very rare, deep blue, semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. This stone was mined from the Afghan mountains, then exported through the Indus Valley civilization, then found its way on sea route to Ur in Iraq. There is a lapis lazuli rock on display in the British Museum, and the skilled artisans of Ur made some of the most intricate designs from this semi-precious rock, from the smallest artifacts that you can hold in the palm of your hand to the most detailed ornaments. These men were absolutely brilliant at what they did, and men today are still amazed that people from so very early were able to produce such highly skilled and detailed levels of art out of solid rock. But amidst the height of this highly sophisticated culture, at its zenith, one man and his family migrated out of this technologically advanced society, and that will be the main focus of the next project. But let us summarize this study. This study was not looking at neither morals nor ethics, just history, and the effects the past has on us to this very day. And we have seen how archaeology has been one of the major windows into the past, and men have to admit that the further we go back, the more advanced man is. We have inherited governments, harps, board games, ceramics, armies, mining, soldering, and trade, and our laws from our ancient predecessors. So where are we going with all this information? Well, we shall find out in Part 2.
In Genesis chapter 11 and verse 31 is the first time Ur of the Chaldees is mentioned in the Holy Scriptures, where a family just picked up themselves, migrated and left this highly sophisticated culture. Why did they leave this culture, and what were they leaving behind? And who created that vast Sumerian city complex, and what effect does that city have on our modern world today?
In Ur of the Chaldees Part 2, we will be briefly looking at a man whose name after many millennia still lingers heavily in the Middle East from the aftermath of the modern day horrific wars. He created a rebellion against the government of heaven, and using his extraordinary height and strength, he established the first government on earth, where he made a deep impression, and he was worshipped all around the world in almost every culture. He was known as a mighty hunter, and what made him famous was that he was the first to introduce urban planning, districts, regionalism, and tight grid-like cities to keep society close to surveillance and under tight control. And today, with almost 3/4 of the Earth's population tightly squeezed onto just 2.8% of the Earth's land mass, cities will once again be used to control the masses, especially through the power of surveillance. And as this man created a name to establish his authority on the earth, the last world power on earth will revive his system and will also establish a name to enhance its own power. Who is this man who created the technologically advanced system of Sumer, also known as Shinar?